So today we're going to talk about something, continuing this whole idea of reflection and celebration that really struck me. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so meaty. And this is so big. I don't even know how I'm going to cover it all today. I may have to do a two-part thing. And we're going to do what we always do, and we'll go where the Spirit leads us. But here's the crux. I talked about how important it is to reflect and how important for me it is to continue to feed me so that I can serve you guys, right? Listening to things, learning things, podcasts, reading, all that kind of stuff that I hadn't been doing as much of. And this weekend, I got a chance to listen to On Point. So I love NPR, y'all. So I got a chance to listen to On Point on NPR. And they were interviewing this woman named Loretta Ross. She is currently a professor at Smith College. And her whole thing was about, she's got a book now, I think it's already released, called Calling in the Call Out Culture. So that's what got my attention at first. And then the host started introducing her and talking about her history. And she was a civil rights activist. She is a feminist, a human rights activist. And when she first started, what she was working with is people who were working hard to get out of supremacist groups, so out of the Aryan Nation, out of the KKK, those kind of things. And as I started listening to her, I'm like, this is exactly an example of what I talk about in terms of getting information to understand your perspective, to maybe challenge your perspective, to think differently, but to also maybe solidify what you're talking about. And this was so powerful to me that I actually am sending an email to her to see if I can get her on the show. She'd have to call in because, again, she's at Smith College. So there's two pieces. There's this whole idea of what's a cult versus what is a movement. And then there's the idea of calling in the call out culture. And I want to talk about both of those, but I may not get to both of them. So I want to start with this cult versus movement, because we're seeing a lot of that right now. And it really does relate to your career. It relates to business. It relates to corporate environments or business environments, team environments, all of that kind of stuff. So what she says is, if you look at the difference between a cult and a movement, in a movement, you have many, many, many different people. Good morning, Missouri. Good morning, Texas. We have many, many different people with many, many different ideas who are all moving in the same direction towards the same goal. That's a movement. In a cult, you have many, many different people with the exact same idea moving in the same direction. And not only do they have the same idea, they are in a situation where they are not only discouraged from, but not allowed to ask questions or think critically. So again, in a movement, a lot of people, a lot of different ideas moving in the same direction. So it's fluid, it's adaptable, it is inclusive, it is innovative. In a cult, the only person that's really being adaptive, innovative, pushing forward is the leader, because everyone else is not enabled or empowered to ask questions or think differently. You have to fall in line. Cult versus movement. And what struck me about that is when you think about your work environment, whether you have your own business and so you're creating a culture, or whether you are in a company and you've walked into a culture, what does that culture look like? So I'm using cult and movement broadly, but there are many organizations that feel more like a cult than they feel like a movement. And we talk a lot about diversity. We say we want to have diverse organizations, and I will categorize it like this: having diversity, different people, different experiences, different ideas. That's a check the box exercise. That is the cult. Many different people, many different ideas. The movement is inclusion. Inclusion is when you take all those different people with different ideas and you enable them to actually participate so that you gather that information. You understand that perspective. You're able to take all of that and move forward differently. And because you're all going towards the same goal, deviations along the path aren't that big a deal because everybody's moving in the same direction. And you actually feel like you're garnering and gaining better information and you're moving forward better because you've got all this data and all this insight from different perspectives. So it actually makes it stronger, makes it more meaty, makes it heavier to be able to have multiple different people with different perspectives. That's a movement. When I look at organizations, I think of Zappos. They just lost their CEO. Their original founder just passed away at 46, very young. Zappos was a movement. It wasn't a shoe store. It was a customer service business. That's what made it so successful. It was all about service. That was a movement. People who started to work for Zappos, people who followed Zappos, people who bought from Zappos, that was about the movement around service. How can we be of service? Their customer service is fantastic. No questions asked, that kind of thing. That was a movement. Arguably, at least before they just had this issue, Google and Tesla could be considered movements. Lots of innovation, lots of different people, lots of ideas, noisy situations, open workspaces, all of these kind of things, right? They call them Googlers. And then you have Big Kim. You have the GEs of the world. You have, those organizations that have been around 100, 200, 300 years that have gotten so comfortable with the way they've always done things that those are cults, cult-like. Those places where you can't have different ideas. You can't express dissension. You can't ask questions because it's seen as contrary to the way things have always been done, contrary to where the organization wants to move. Those leaders in departments who don't want anyone having a different idea than theirs, who don't want anyone to challenge their authority. Those are cult-like organizations and situations. And so if you think about this whole idea of cult versus movement being surrounded in or grounded in the fundamental idea of having opinions and asking questions, that's what makes the difference in movement. That's what enables us to go forward and make things happen and innovate and create, right? Those are that ability to challenge and ask questions and to push ideas forward is what really creates movement. So when I was listening to Professor Ross, and she was talking about this cult versus movement, I thought, this is such an innovative idea, because businesses are not going to want to think about themselves as cults. And yet, there are so many cultures in organizations that are absolutely toxic. And they are toxic because they suppress ideation. They suppress innovation. They suppress dissension. And in ideation, innovation, and dissension is progress. Because that person's dissension may be grounded in some experience or some knowledge. Knowledge plus experience equals wisdom. In some wisdom that they have that the organization would benefit from. But because it's an organization that believes that everyone should be thinking the same thing, moving in the same direction, it creates a toxicity that the person who is different feels the heat and the heaviness and the oppression and the disconnect and the fear in some cases of that, right? Because even those in a cult, those who try to get out, there is a level of fear in trying to get out. One, there's a level of fear that you have now acknowledged something that was different than what you have been taught in some cases from very, very young, right? People who have been in those, you hear stories of people who've gotten out of them after 20 or 30 years. That indoctrination is ingrained in who they are. And so there's a lot of fear. And so that courage to decide it's time to get out because this just no longer feels right. And the amount of how much it feels right is so much bigger than the fear of the fear of staying, and the pain of staying is so much bigger than the fear of what might be on the other side. And so when we talk about cults versus movements, and you're looking at your career and you're looking at the businesses you build or the teams that you're building, what environment are you creating? And if you are creating an environment where people are unable to dissent, I dissent, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If you create a culture where people are unable to dissent, are you creating a movement and an environment that can be innovative and creative and you can really get to the goals you want? Or are you creating a cult? Are you creating an environment or a culture of yes people? Because that's dangerous. People who are only going to tell you what you want to hear, you don't know. They will tell you yes until you're walking off the cliff and drowning. Because why should they invest in telling you anything other than what you want to hear? Because you've demonstrated to them that all you want to hear is what you want to hear. And anything else is going to create pain for them. So why would they intentionally do that? It takes a lot of courage. And especially if you think about where we are in 2020. There are many people who had a bunch of courage, but maybe their courage was kind of teetering on the edge, right? They were just kind of stepping into who they are. Along comes 2020, people are losing their jobs. People are having to go home. You're having to figure out how to make sure your performance is noted. And all of a sudden, whatever courage you had to be vocal might be gone, or at least severely challenged, because there's fear of losing your job. There's fear of not being able to support your family. There's fear of somehow being disconnected or being dismissed. And so it is important to really reflect, because again, we're talking about reflection, reflect on, even in these times that have been very, very difficult and very strange, what are you creating? What are you creating? Are you creating a culture of movement and engagement and inclusion to really take the next level and to move exponentially? Or are you creating an environment of toxicity, a cult, a yes culture, a culture that only exists if you agree? And you get a choice. I mean, these organizations that are years and years old, they have a choice. And I've been in those organizations where if you had a differing opinion, you better get ready if you wanted to express it out loud. And I'm generally not one to just sit on that kind of stuff. I'm always cautious in how I say it, but very rarely do I not say something. Very, very rarely. In fact, I can't even put my finger on a time when I just decided to be quiet. That's just the truth. That's just the truth, Jerry. I can't think of a time when I just decided not to say anything. I'm sure there was a time, and it was probably related to the fact that I had just reached a point where I'm like, you know what, I'm just not going to say anything because it doesn't matter. Actually, that's not true. As I got ready to leave the last place I was in, I got to the point where I'm like, no. Most of the time I still said something, but there were a couple of times I'm like, we've had this conversation so many times, I'm just not having it again. Now, my words didn't say anything else, but I know my face said, we've talked about this. Let's not talk about it again, right? So you have to really examine in your leadership style and in your business, in your environment, what are you creating? Because you are responsible for what you create. You're responsible for your words. You're responsible for how you treat people. You're responsible for your actions and words aligning. See, all of this ties together, guys. I may talk about different topics, but it all ties together to that personal accountability, the fact that we have choices, and the fact that how we show up impacts others. It impacts our integrity. It impacts our ability to be effective. And we have to own that. And so what environment are you creating? Can people freely come to you with differing ideas and differing opinions? Or not? And be honest about that. Because what are you losing by not enabling people to show up as their whole selves? By not enabling people to tell you the truth. You don't have to be disrespectful to tell the truth, right? That's where I think sometimes it gets to be a problem. It also gets to be a problem because people get comfortable with what they know. And that's the thing about cults as well. Is because, as Loretta Ross said, you can't ask questions in cults. The other thing about cults is that it promotes intellectual laziness. because you're not allowed to think. You're not allowed to discern. You're not allowed to dissect what you're hearing. You're supposed to just follow blindly. So no one's forcing you to think or discern or to have a perspective or to reason. They create cultures of yes people. They create cultures that just mimic what they've heard, right? It's just like babies. Babies mimic what they heard. That's how they learn. That's why they always say, be careful what you say around your kids, because kids listen to you and they will mimic. And especially as they're learning to talk, you got to be careful what words you use, because those will come out in public. And people are going to look at you because they know they didn't just make it up. They got it from somewhere, right? So that idea of creating an environment where people no longer have to think is a problem. As leaders, when you don't allow people to make decisions, when you don't allow people to think, when you don't allow them to have opinions, that's when you start getting really tired. That's when you start getting really overworked, because the people that work for you are pushing all their decisions up. They're not making one decision. They are not doing anything that you haven't specifically told them to do. Because what you've taught them is if they do that, there's going to be pain associated with that. That is a cult-like culture. That is not a flexible culture. That's not a noisy culture. That is not an innovative culture. And the reason I said Google may or may not be in that kind of innovative side is there's something going around right now. And now a bunch of employees have actually signed a petition, not a letter, but a petition. There was a research scientist who was terminated from Google. Google claims she resigned. She says she was terminated. The employees who worked for her and a number of other employees also say she was terminated. And it was because she wrote a paper that actually was contrary or not as positive about some of the work that Google was doing around, I believe it was around AI. And so all of these kind of things happened. All of a sudden, she didn't turn stuff in on time. All of a sudden, she wasn't supposed to, all of a sudden her performance got to be an issue because what she was doing and her perspective and her opinion were different than the norm. Now, I'm spreading peanut butter, y'all, because I am not sitting in Google, but I've seen this a lot. I've seen this a lot in my career. Is that all of a sudden when you're trying to get somebody quiet or trying to stifle something that may be contrary to what the company wants to do, all of a sudden the person is a performance issue. And I'm telling you, HR people, you need to pay attention to this. If all of a sudden somebody who's never had a problem, who's always been a stellar person, all of a sudden somebody's trying to say we need to get them out of the organization, you need to start doing some research. Don't get caught up in that madness. You need to determine from a strictly HR perspective, you are supposed to have a level of professional skepticism and independence from the business, right? You have to understand and support the business, but you also have to support employees. It's a really weird line to walk in HR. A very weird line. You are a representative of the company and an advocate for the people. It is a really weird place to walk. And if you don't have courage, you don't need to be in HR. So if you start seeing kind of this movement that it looks like it appears happened at Google, and of course, we're not in Google, so we don't know all the details. If you are seeing that, you need to start doing some research and start paying attention, because you don't want to get caught up in some kind of termination that makes no sense because somebody just got loud about it because they didn't like what they heard, or they're about to get embarrassed. So those cults or cult-like environments create some very interesting behavior, not only on the part of the people that are working there, but on the part of the leaders. And we need to be aware of that, because often the result of that is not even close to what we wanted. It's not even close to what we expected or what we need to have happening. So don't get caught up in many people, same idea, same direction. Again, many people, same idea, same direction, that's cult-like. Many people, many ideas, same direction, that's a movement. So when people start talking about, Black Lives Matter or even LULAC or any of these other social, the women's marches, in any of these social kind of movements, and they start talking about them like cults, there may be people in there who have cult-like thinking, but the organization themselves are movements. Many people, many different ideas moving towards the same goal. The goal being ensuring that all lives matter. The goal being ensuring there is equity and equitable treatment for women in business, in general, in society, right? So that whole idea of movement is enabling dissension, enabling the exploration of different perspectives, enabling the strength and the beauty and the innovation that comes from many different people with many different ideas who are all focused on the same goal. Because through that, you may take some deviations, but those deviations may actually be great learning that you needed to get to the goal faster or sooner or better. Or may even tweak how the direction of the goal is in the first place. But if you create an environment where people cannot participate, where they cannot have different thoughts, where they cannot show up and be who they are and ask questions, you are not in innovation. And you can't expect to be innovative, and you can't be mad. Because that's what happens. We have lots of organizations. I've been in these organizations that are innovate, innovate, innovate. We want to be innovative. We want to be innovative. We got to be innovative. Ooh, but don't make a mistake. Wait, we need to wait 4 years before we put that out. Wait a minute. We said we were going to get this done in 2 months. And now when we look back at the data, we really need to take 3, but we can't go back and say 2 because that's embarrassing. Those aren't movements. Those are cultures that become toxic. Because people will listen to what you say, they will believe what you do. And if every time someone dissents, they get demoted, they don't get on the next project, they are talked about differently in the talent review meetings, when that kind of stuff happens, you are telling people you don't want innovation. You're telling people you don't want different ideas, you don't want people to think differently about things. You are telling them through your behavior that you've got a toxic cult-like environment. You don't have a movement. You don't have an organization of inclusion. You have a dictatorship. That's what you got. And so we're seeing a lot of this play out now. I've had conversations with people, or I've had people come on my timeline and say some things, or I've been watching people's timelines. And some of them I just want to ask, why do you believe that? Why do you believe that? And the few that I've asked that cannot tell me. The only thing they say is, well, so-and-so said it. Okay, but did you go read it? Did you go look at the research? Did you go, well, no. Then how do you know? How do you know? And I'm not saying you don't trust people. There are people you trust that when they tell you something, you believe it. But when there are things that are happening that are so toxic, that are contrary to what general society knows, right? Like contrary to science. What is it about the other side of the story that has reined you in, that has told you that it's true? And I'm just fascinated. If I can get over my irritation and frustration, I'm absolutely fascinated by how the human brain and the human spirit can just say, okay, I'm good with that. I believe that. Because I don't know that it's so much a belief in the thing as it is a desire not to believe the other thing. You see what I mean? It's not people. It could be people. I mean, it's who is telling me this? How do I feel about them? What is my station, right? If I believe this thing, does that make me feel better about what's going on in my life? Right? It becomes behavioral. So many times it's not necessarily based in fact, it's based on how it makes me feel. If I am in a situation where I feel put upon or disconnected or less than or less worthy or whatever, fearful, and all of a sudden I get a message that makes me not feel any of those things, well, that's the message I'm going to hang on to, whether it's true or not, because it makes me feel better.
One quick question. Can it be, when you said that, because I was talking about that earlier today on my show, about the world needs more love, because while I'm watching the news, I find myself getting irritated, angry, because I'm like, where are you getting this from? Why do you believe that?
Right.
Could it be that even if you don't believe it because you keep hearing it over and over again and it's frustrating you, you can almost mess around and be on the other end of wrong?
And yeah, it makes absolute sense. I think it's what we've talked about before. You got to be careful what you let into your mind. And so, and it's a fine line, right? You have to have a whole different level of desire to learn to be able to take in a bunch of different perspectives and not get swayed. right? To still be able to stand in your own research and develop your own opinion. That takes a lot of work and a lot of energy. And it's easy. It's easier. I will admit, it is easier just to read something, hear somebody say something, watch somebody, and just believe that because it's easier than to think about why it's not true. It's easier to just take things at face value than it is to take the next step to ask the next question. It is easier to just say, okay. And that's what happens in organizations. People get tired of fighting. I know I did. You just get tired of fighting. And you get tired of fighting the same battle. So finally you're just like, okay. That's what happens in relationships. People get tired of fighting. Okay. Okay. I'm done now. And I'm one of those personalities that I don't give up easily. If there's something that's going on, I'm going to be in it to win it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to hash it out. But when I'm done, I'm done. I'm not mad. I'm not upset. I'm not screaming and yelling. I'm just through.
Yeah.
And I'm generally pretty quiet. So if I get quiet, something's wrong. Because I love an intellectual argument. I love it, right? That's why I talk about my friend Renee all the time. Why we get along so well. We are on opposite sides of almost everything. But the conversation is so good. And every once in a while, we'll sway each other. Most of the time, we don't. But most of the time, we're like, okay, well, I see what you're saying, but I still don't agree. I understand, but I don't agree. And this is why I don't agree. And we can appreciate that in each other.
That's good.
Right?
How do you keep your temper down from not being...
Oh, we don't.
Oh.
That doesn't mean we don't get mad or irritated. I shouldn't say we don't get mad. That doesn't say we don't get irritated and the discussions don't get heated, because sometimes they do get heated. But there is such a deep connection there around just mutual respect. And that's what's missing in a lot of organizations.
Do you keep trying to sway her to your opinion and then, you just let it go? At
some point, in the midst of because there's some of these conversations, it's a he. There's some of these conversations that we've been having for years. I've known this person 30 years. Some of these conversations we've been having for years. And we still disagree. And so now we just reached the point where we're going to agree to disagree. But every once in a while, one of us will bring up the old conversation just to see if something's changed, right? So some of it becomes about, the hunt and the changing of mind. Some of it becomes about the game.
Did any of it ever change?
There have been times when we may not have changed our full opinion, but we absolutely have understood a perspective and have changed the way we talk about it, right? We have developed a different appreciation for the other side, so that the way we talk about the issue has changed. Not necessarily our opinion or our perspective or where we come down on it, but an appreciation for the other side. And that is a beautiful thing. Because again, even if you don't, it's all these memes you're saying. We can disagree without being disagreeable. We don't have to all think the same thing. And no one is monolithic. I said this on the last couple of shows. My brother said that the other day. All black people don't think the same. All women don't think the same. All whatever insert here don't think the same. That's the difference between a cult and a movement, y'all. Right? Because many people thinking exactly the same thing, that's a cult. Many people thinking exactly the same thing, that's a cult. That's not what this is. That's not what society is. Society is a bunch of different people with a bunch of different ideas, trying to do a bunch of different stuff. Right? But that idea of connecting to someone and at least getting an appreciation for their perspective and their opinion, because their opinion is generally based on their experience and who they are and how they grew up. I mean, there are some people who form opinions without any research whatsoever, because that's just who they are. It's too much work to do the research, but they got an opinion. You just got to know who those people are and be okay with that or not. I know many of those, and I just don't have those deep conversations with those people. Because see, then I get irritated. Because I'm good to have an intellectual conversation or a heated conversation with somebody who's actually done some research. But if all you've got from me is no, just because, no. Just because doesn't cut it.
I did that the other day to somebody. I said, oh, you crazy for real. And then I just stopped the conversation because I realized this is going to make my head hurt.
Right,
yeah,
right.
You just don't have to engage in it.
No.
Yeah.
Because the other thing about really good conversations and deep conversations and conversations that have dissenting opinions is it makes your brain work. Yeah. Remember, I talked about how listening actively is really important, because if you listen to understand, versus listening to respond, you actually have an opportunity to improve your own argument because you understand the other person's perspective and where they're coming from. And that can actually give you more data and more quote unquote ammunition for your side. So you want to be willing to be in movement. You want to be in flow. You want to be not so tied to your perspective and your opinion that you're immovable. Now, I'm not talking about, your moral compass and all that kind of stuff, because there are things from a moral perspective that we all stand on. That's not what I mean. Your deep-seated values. That's not what I mean. Everything beyond your deep-seated values is negotiable. Everything beyond that is negotiable. And so if you're not willing to gather information, so here's an easier way to put it. If, in fact, the folks at NASA were unwilling to believe additional data and that things were possible, we never would have been to the moon. Never. We wouldn't have the space station. We wouldn't be going up. SpaceX wouldn't be sending more tests up to see if eventually we can have people go to Mars. If we were not organisms that try to deeply understand and challenge and innovate and move and see what if, we wouldn't be where we are. We wouldn't be able to be connected now with Zoom and Google Meets and all this other stuff, because nobody would have had the wherewithal to invent that stuff, because we just believed that what we had was all that could be. But that's not who we are as organisms, as beings. There's always something different. There's always something more. There's always something better. And so really think about your organizations. Think about how you treat people. If you're just in your career, how you show up, because again, leadership is not about position. Leadership is not about position. Leadership is about action and behavior. And so how are you showing up in a way that supports movement? Many different people thinking many different things, moving in the same direction, versus cult. Many different people thinking the exact same thing, moving in the same direction. Unable to ask questions, unable to discern, unable to think critically, because they're not allowed to. And once you are not allowed to do something for an extended period of time, you will be unable to do it. Think about exercise. That's why it's so hard to get on an exercise program, and so hard to get back to it once you stop. That's why maintenance is so much easier than getting there. So much easier than getting there. Once you stop eating well, once you stop exercising, you may have gotten up to being able to do, 500 push-ups a day. Then you stop for a couple of months. That first time you get back trying to do 500, you might get 20. Because your body is no longer in the habit of being able to exert itself in that way. You've taken time off. You haven't exercised it. We have to exercise our brains too. We have to exercise our minds. We have to exercise our spirits. We have to exercise our logic, or it gets stagnant. That's why you read a lot. That's why you listen to a lot. That's why you pay attention to a lot. You don't have to believe everything you hear. You don't have to believe everything you read or see. I just encourage you to read and listen and hear and see as many different things as you can possibly tolerate, because how do you know your truth if you've never heard anyone else's? How do you know what your reality is if you have never challenged what something else could be? That's why you hear with students and with kids and with children, yes, it's about access, right? For those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged, it's about access. But it's not the access in and of itself. It's the fact that access leads to exposure. That's why representation is so important. If you've never seen it, how can you believe it's possible? If you have never seen it, how can you believe it's possible? Now, again, you have those scientists, you have people like that think everything's possible, right? They're just wired that way. But they have also been exposed to people who support that anything is possible, that all things are possible. And so in movements, it's all about questioning and what's possible and how is it possible and what can we do to get there, and what did you see? Well, I saw this, and maybe we can bring those things together, or didn't see that coming. Did anybody else see that coming? Let's try not to do that again. That's the beauty in in being in a movement versus being in a cult. It's the freedom to think, the freedom to be, the freedom to exist, the freedom to bring all of your gifts to the ultimate goal. So as you are moving through your career and you are building teams or you are influencing people, are you influencing them in a manner that encourages movement? Or are you leading and influencing in a way that just encourages falling in line? That encourages yes people. That prevents or discourages speaking truth to power. Talked about that last month. It is so important to be able to speak truth to power. But if you're in an environment that speaking truth to power is painful, we naturally want to avoid pain. It's that fight, flight or freeze response. We don't want to be in pain if we don't have to be.
Yes, people can actually be draining. You would think that it would be encouraging to someone who wanted yes people, but if you have just only yes people, then you're left up to thinking about everything and deciding everything and moving everything and yeah. And so sometimes yes people think that that's the way into the door, but it really isn't.
And it's interesting, if you have a team that is unwilling to challenge, that's unwilling to just do stuff, that's unwilling to take a risk, you will be working so hard.
Yes.
Because you're doing everything. And as you said, Jerry, what people don't understand is if they never have an opinion, if they never step out there, if they are invisible, they're invisible. So all of those things that they want, the promotion that they want, the extra work that they want, the extra project that they want, how do they think they're going to get that if they've never demonstrated capability, willingness, none of that? They're just saying yes and being quiet. Now, there are always exceptions, right? Sometimes you just have quiet people. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about general, right? How do you really think you're able to impact a business if all you ever say is yes to everything? If all you ever do is agree with everything? Because no one agrees with everything all the time. And I know I used an absolute. No one agrees with everything all the time. Because here's the thing. You may be saying yes, but in your mind, you're like, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard.
And your work ethic will show that you're not in a total agreement with that.
It will.
Yeah. You can say yes all day long, but
your behavior
will show the difference.
Because people hear your words, they believe your actions. They hear your words, they believe your actions. And so if you're saying yes, 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 and you're going on saying, I can't believe we did that, or you're dragging your feet, or you're not supportive, or you're behind the scenes messing stuff up, people see that. People see that. Good morning, California. People see that all the time. It's called the false advocate. Right? It's one of the ways to put it. False advocate. Saying one thing in public and then dissenting behind the scenes. So, and almost, I would not say whistleblowers were false advocates, because most of the time whistleblowers have actually tried to say something publicly and have been forced not to. So they're forced to do something behind the scenes. So I really want, this week, as you reflect, one, go listen to some podcasts. Go listen to something else. Go hear somebody you've never heard before. I mean, I'm telling you, this interview with this woman I was fired up. Because again, the other piece that she talked about was this call-in culture versus call-out. And that's one where I'm not sure I agree with her, quite frankly. And maybe since we have some time, I'll talk about that too. Because this cult versus movement thing is really powerful. But let me talk, I'll touch quickly on it, and then if we need to talk about it next week, we can do that too. The next thing she talked about in this cult versus movement, because again, this is a human rights activist. She led into talking about the calling in the call out culture. And the call out culture is this idea that now we just put people on blast. You do something crazy, it's all over social media, we're calling people out of their name, we're shaming people. The purpose is to shame people, theoretically to change behavior. But I think most people now are just shaming people for the love of shaming people. And one of the things she said is, I have a problem. The reason I started talking about calling in the call-out culture was, one, because of her experience, which I'll talk about or remind you guys about in a minute. But the other reason was, she said, how can I call myself a human rights activist if I am not supporting all human rights, including those people who truly have bad behavior but want to change it or need to change it? And I'm not willing to support their change in that behavior. Not saying it doesn't need to be called out, but there's a way to do that that is productive to behavioral change as opposed to just shaming people. So calling in the call out culture. And this is where, while I'm really hoping that I get to interview this woman. I'm just believing. I'm just going to call it. I'm going to get to meet, Loretta Ross and interview her. The reason this one struck me in this whole interview, the cult versus movement, was clear. This one hit me a little weird, and this is why. Because speaking truth to power is a form of calling people out. So as I heard her say, we shouldn't be calling people out. That's a way that we shame people. It's people that, do look like us, act like us. They're in our same vein, and we just call them out. It's just mean, it's hateful. And I'm exaggerating. I'm paraphrasing all the stuff she said. Again, this was on the show On Point. I think it was December the 3rd was the airing. The show was On Point on NPR. And her name is Loretta Ross. So you can Google it. So I'm paraphrasing here. But her point was, that whole idea of calling people out just to shame them does nothing to change them. Does nothing to change the behavior. And in fact, depending on how you shame them, how you call them out, could actually make them dig their heels into whatever they did. I mean, because if you think about the call out culture now, we've got people showing up at folks' houses with guns and all kinds of other stuff. We have people putting people's kids on blast. It has gotten out of control with social media. It has gotten out of control. And I was always taught, my brother and I were always taught, that you praise in public, you criticize in private. That has gone away in the age of social media. Because we are quick to criticize people publicly. And even our criticism, it's one thing if you're going to criticize somebody publicly, you can do that in a way that is respectful. And you are disagreeing about the idea or the position and not calling out the person personally. And that's why the call out culture has gotten to be so bad. Because it is attacking individuals, not ideas or behaviors. Because people are not necessarily their ideas or their behaviors. Their experiences have formed their ideas and behaviors. But that isn't necessarily who they are inherently. Now, there are some people who what you see is what you get, for sure. For sure. But there are others, and most of us, almost I would argue all of us, are formed, and who we are is formed by our experiences and what we've seen, what we felt, what has happened to us, what has not happened to us. And so this calling in the call out culture, her perspective is this: instead of calling people out, let's call them in. So when she talked about dealing with these folks that were trying to get out of these in this case, white supremacist groups, the Aryan Nation, the KKK, the challenge for them was, where do they go? They want to get out. They didn't necessarily want to go to the FBI or CIA in a way because they didn't want to turn in, other folks. But they wanted to get out. And how do they do that? How do they take this feeling that said, yeah, this isn't right anymore, but I don't know what is because I've been indoctrinated for years. How can we call them in and support them for change and support them for movement? So the call out culture, the fallout of the call out, is that we aren't necessarily always changing behavior. Yes, it is now less publicly acceptable, again, to be calling the police on somebody just because they show up looking a certain kind of way. And if you do that, somebody's going to call you out and shame you. But the problem with that is, have we really changed that person's behavior? Because when we see that happen, and y'all stay with me here, when we see that happen, think about the comments you see. Someone has called the police on somebody, then everybody goes in on them and shames them. They come back and apologize. I'm so sorry. That's not who I am. That's not what I meant. I shouldn't have done it. But because we're in this call out culture, how many of those opinions or responses to the apology or the acknowledgement are actually positive? Versus, yeah, I don't believe that. You're only saying you're sorry because you got shamed and outed publicly. You know, and we're all guilty of that. I'm guilty of that too. I'm like, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Because my experience shows I've seen enough of your behavior to know this is actually what you believe. But I've also seen enough of your behavior to know how much you lack courage. And now that it's public what you believe, now you feel bad about it. So it's not that your belief has changed. It's that you feel bad that everybody knows beyond your tight circle what your belief is. And it may now impact you. And the other side of the call out culture is it does actually impact people. People are losing jobs. They're losing houses. It is severely impacting people. Not saying that there shouldn't be consequences for the stuff we do that is crazy. But should somebody really lose their house because they're ignorant?
But on the reverse side of the call out culture, not saying anything to ask this question. Let's say as it relates to the president and we're wondering why many of the Republicans are not saying anything. Is that because you think they're saying it behind closed doors, or should they publicly say what is happening is wrong?
See, that's what's interesting about the calling in the call out culture. So my perspective, when I look at it now, that is about courage. It's about courage and it's about fear. There's fear of the individual because the individual has shown himself to be vindictive. But there's also fear of what are my constituents going to say, because how many of them believe the same thing that this individual says? And if I say something different, then I lose my position, right? It's fear that my courage, my willingness to stand up is going to impact my livelihood. And courage is not easy. Courage ain't for sissies, right? It is not easy. And so when I look at the failure of people on both sides of the aisle to call out behavior on both sides of the aisle, it all stems back from my perspective and what I've seen to fear. Fear of being able to maintain my position of power, of being able to maintain my lifelong, pension, of my access to areas and venues and people and events simply because of my title and my position. I don't want to give up my position. And if I say something, I might have to give up my position. It's also about integrity. Because so many of those people really do believe that what's going on is not right. But that fear of protection, that need to protect, prevents them from being vocal.
When you said this on both sides of the fence, can I say this on the other
Yes.
side? When you talk about what I'm thinking about Biden, and I'm thinking about there's some who in the black community said he's not choosing enough progressives to be on his side. Is that something you should call out publicly, or is that something that should be worked out amongst themselves?
But that's what we're talking about right now, right? So yeah, we have all of this stuff, all this craziness that's happening, and we're calling out Republicans, we're calling out the right for not saying anything, and that is true at some level. Everything is kind of in the middle. But then on the left, we have, let me stop back in the middle. There are extremes on both sides. Extremes on both sides. There are so many people in the middle, but the middle I think is tired. The middle is tired. And the middle is not necessarily made up of people who are going to publicly fight. They have apparently fought with their vote, but they're not going to publicly get out there and mix it up. They're in the middle. They're moderate. And there are some people in the middle who just want to be left alone. They don't even want to think about it. Those are the ones I worry about more. I'm like, you need to step up now. You need to, because silence is consent, right?
Yeah.
So just know that there are extremes, and what we hear right now is the extremes, because the extremes are loud and the extremes are never going to agree. Never, ever, ever, ever. That's why they're extremes. What's happening in the middle is that you've got the folks that are in the extremes but kind of closer to the middle that are now starting to say, but you're not doing enough. You're not having enough progressives. You're not having enough people talk about the things that are big and the things that are important to the party. And so just like there is a crisis on the right, there is a crisis and will be a crisis on the left. What is the identity of the party? What does society need and want and look for? Because again, we are theoretically in a two-party system. Theoretically. I mean, there is an independent party, there's a Green Party, there's all these other parties. But theoretically, if you look at history, we have basically been a country of two parties. And when you have something that's that big, you're going to have many, many differing opinions in both of those two sides. So you get the real extremes that are going to, the Green Party or Independent or something like that, right? They just go to something else. They can't even take it. They're just going somewhere else. But those who still have a need to fix it or change it or make an impact are in what exists and just making lots of noise. And so when we talk about calling out, the same thing happens when you are calling out people to do something different than what they're doing now. And it still gets back to, what are you calling out and how are you calling it out? Because if all you're doing is arguing, yelling and screaming and fussing and fighting, nobody's going to hear that. People start tuning that out. And if you're not coming with some kind of argument that is based in some kind of fact, why am I going to listen to you? And those who are on the extremes don't even think they're extreme. They believe that they are speaking for the majority of people, because the people in the middle, the majority that are in the middle, because it's a natural curve, the majority that are in the middle are tired and aren't saying anything. So those who are speaking can take the pulpit of, I'm speaking for everybody. This is what Democrats want. The Democratic Party wants to be more progressive. The people want us to be more progressive. All young people want it to be more progressive. Okay, very few things, again, are absolutes. Very few things are absolutes. We all absolutely have to die. Because we all don't absolutely have to pay taxes, clearly. But we all have to die, right? We have to be born before we can do that. So the one absolute is that we will not be here forever. Everything else is negotiable. Everything else is a matter of degrees. Everything else is a matter of degrees. And so if you're going to call out someone, number one, make sure you understand what you're calling out and why. Don't be one of those people that's a just because. Because think about when your parents said that and you keep asking, why? Because I said so. Does that really end the argument for you? Really? You may stop talking, because once you get the because I said so, it's over for them. So you may stop arguing, but your mind hasn't necessarily changed because you don't understand why. So if you really want to be able to create a culture of movement, again, if you think about cults, you can't ask questions. Many people think of the same thing, move in the same direction. If we want to do something about this calling in the call out culture, it's about asking why. When that person is calling the police, when that person is shooting up somebody's house, when that person is stealing, when that kid is not succeeding, why? Because when we ask why and we can get to the root cause, we may actually be able to come up with a solution that makes a difference. But when we just assume we know, or when we just stand in our position because it's easier to do that than to actually think critically, to actually do some research because we potentially may see something different than what we believe, then we get what we've got now. The people that scream the loudest get the most attention, at least initially. And then the people that are in the middle just get tired and stop talking. I just want all the people who are moderate and who are not talking to remember that silence is consent. And if you don't agree, you need to say something. If you don't agree, you need to act differently. If you don't agree, you need to support ways in which things can be changed, or you can at least make an impact. Because there are far many people who are in the middle than there are who are in the extremes. And there are far more people in the middle who understand how to collaborate and communicate and how to dissent and disagree without being disagreeable. It's just that all of us are tired. They're just tired because everything else is so loud and so nasty and so ugly. So we're going to talk some more. Let me check my time here. Oh, I'm over again. Because I have so much fun with y'all.
Wait, can I say this?
Yes.
Because when you said that about the middle, there was this pastor that came on, and on social media there's been a lot of pastors, evangelicals, who have been so far to the right and just so angry. But this one came on, he said, yes, I voted for this president. I did this, I did that. He said, but I'm not in agreement. We're gone too far. It's gotten too violent. And more people were willing to listen to him because there's so many people who says, yeah, I may believe in this person and I may believe in this person, but I don't believe in all the violence.
Exactly.
And so many, you hit it on the head, so many of those people are staying quiet.
Yes.
And they're waiting
Yes.
for somebody that's in the middle who says, I can care less about either one of them. I
We
just
can't
want
do
the noise
this.
to stop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That this isn't going to work. This is not working.
Wow.
Whoever's the occupant of the White House, this is not working. This is not who we are. We do not show up in front of people's houses with pitchforks, right? We don't do that. We don't do that. And now we've gotten to the place where apparently we do. And unless we say that's unacceptable, it will continue. So.
Thank you for your new suggestion. I just downloaded the NPR.org app. So
yes, it is. I'm telling you.
Can you throw out those suggestions?
Learn some stuff.
Again?
So here's the thing. I listen to NPR all the time. This particular show was on NPR, but it is a show called On Point. On Point. It was, I think, December the 3rd. And the woman's name, the guest name is Loretta Ross, R-O-S-S, Loretta Ross. The other one where I get a lot of information and just a lot of perspectives. And people say, oh, NPR is left-leaning, all this kind of stuff. I got to tell you.
Is what?
Left-leaning.
Okay.
I got to tell you, when I listen to NPR, they are so in the middle. They are bringing on people from all sides. And then you just make up your opinion.
Yeah.
You make up your opinion, which is what I love. That's what I love about Malcolm Gladwell. He just brings it all. So On Point, Here and Now is another one, and 1A. On Point, Here and Now is another show, and then another show is 1A. So they're all on NPR. You can download them. So yeah. So think about this as we continue through the rest of this year, and you're reflecting. Are you in, and are you creating a cult? Or are you creating a movement? Are you part of a cult? Are you part of a movement? Are you calling people out to help them understand and change behavior? Or just because you're so mad you want to shame them? So we talk here about speaking truth to power, about being honest about who we are and what we think. If you're calling somebody out, ask why. What's the purpose? And be real about it. Because are you making change? Or are you just creating shame? All right, guys. We'll see you next week. Thank y'all for joining so much. Texas, California. Yeah, I think I had some more people on
Georgia.
too. Good morning, Georgia. Georgia, go vote. Go vote.
St. Louis.
St. Louis, good morning. Sherry Duff Patterson.
Galveston.
Galveston. Love having you guys on. All my international people. Love having you guys on too. Thank you for being here. I'll be back with you next week.